Welcome to Gareth Icke Tonight. Now, as I'm sure you're aware by now, everything is connected, from war to disease to cost of living to mass immigration. Everything feeds into something else, and its core will serve the cult's interests. Nothing changes society more than war. Look at how the World War shaped Europe, how 9/11 and the Middle East invasions that followed changed America and indeed the world forever. Now, NATO is angling for a war with Russia. That's been obvious for years, long before Ukraine. The governments and media spent years softening up the public to support action against Moscow. Do you remember the Salisbury poisoning? The Russian Brexit interference, Trump's Russian collusion, all there to make you see them as a threat that must be dealt with. And now they're slowly doing the same with China. Now, I know many people watching this will subscribe to the Wuhan lab leak origin of COVID-19. It's now getting mainstream media coverage and even being spoken about in the corridors of power. It will, in some people's minds, vindicate them. They knew the world leaders were hiding something, and here it is. But just as Matt Hancock's lockdown files pointed towards incompetence and not calculated evil, the lab leak theory also feels like a limited hangout. It keeps the perception of a deadly pandemic alive, and with it, the need for lockdowns, masks, social distancing, mRNA, and all the other tyrannical responses that destroyed our world over the last 3 years. The Rona still exists, but also, and perhaps more importantly, it manipulates public opinion to turn against China. So if you told someone, say 5 years ago, that they should go to war with China, they would rightly tell you, you're probably mentally ill. However, make that same person believe that China created and unleashed a bioweapon on the world that killed nearly 7 million people, some of them his friends and loved ones. They brought the entire planet to its knees, plunging us all into economic oblivion, and then ask them if they support taking military action against China. I think you'll find their answer might be quite different. That's why we need to question everything, even those things that we think are confirming our suspicions.
I was overworked, stressed, working too much. I just kind of went downhill just a little bit. It was round about the 2nd, I think, of November when I called the paramedics. They came out to see me. They told me I got COVID. And they said to me, "How do you feel?" I said, "I feel a bit crap, but I'm okay." They went away, and about 2 or 3 days later, I just went seriously downhill. I couldn't have the strength to get out of bed. I was messing myself, really disillusional, all over the place. And then my partner was away for a few days. She phoned up and she phoned my sister and said, "He's not right here. He's seriously ill." So they phoned the ambulance again. They came straight out and they blew and took me and took me to Barnsley Hospital.
So how did they determine it was COVID? Was it simply a PCR test?
No, I didn't. I had no PCR test. I didn't do a lateral flow. They just said I was burning some incense, and they said it's really powerful. Can you smell that? And I said no, and they said, "Well, you must have COVID." They said to me, if they take me to the hospital, they'll just give me a PCR test or lateral flow and send me home. So there was no like blood pressure, no lateral flow, no PCR, just like an observation, and they sent me away.
So how do you then find yourself in ICU, in a coma? Did you fall into a coma or was it induced?
No, they took me to the hospital. They gave me oxygen straight away. And I'm sure they said to me that if I didn't improve overnight, they'll put me into an induced coma. So I can remember like quite vaguely, next morning I had some breakfast and then I had some dinner at about 12 o'clock. And they took the dinner away from me, and they said to me that they will put me into an induced coma.
That's extraordinary. So they've not diagnosed you in any way whatsoever. They've not done any tests really. So it could be 1,000,001 different things that you've got wrong with you that they're not determined. It's COVID, and then you're sat there eating, and all of a sudden the food's taken away, and they stick you in a coma.
Well, I think the government is going to try to get more control and more power because that's been the trend, right? So they're going to try to blame it on somebody else. I don't know. They're like blame it on COVID. They're trying to blame it on Russia. They're trying to blame it on Putin. Anybody except looking in the mirror, which is, it's kind of nauseating. And look, it's like Stockholm syndrome. And in 2019, I actually ran for parliament to try to help change things. But people weren't ready for change yet. And I think people need to be ready for change, and you can't keep voting for the same people.
No.
I mean, and I heard an interview with Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson are probably the same thing, but except it's a diversion away from reality. So while the economic plunder goes on in the background, they try to create tribalism that, upsets people. So they fight and bicker about things when the bigger picture is left untold. And I think people need to look at the bigger picture, and everybody needs to evaluate how much leverage and how much debt they have relative to what they're earning. I mean, there's going to have to be cutbacks, and there's going to be inflation. We have it's a record cost of living crisis, and the diversions in the media are crazy. I mean, what was the major story? Not the bank failures in America. It was this thing about Gary Lineker.
Yeah.
And who cares? I mean, whatever. I mean, I said, well, why aren't people covering the real stories that impact everyone's life? So people in this country have never had record energy prices right now. And who has to be blamed for the record energy prices is the government. Because in 2001, 2002, I wrote a white paper for the government telling them this country would go dark if we didn't replace our generation assets. And people in the north of England remember AES Drax was the biggest coal-fired power plant in Europe, throughout Europe, and generating a lot of electricity for the UK. And they mothballed that, and they never replaced some of the British energy nuclear power plants that went offline. So as I said, if you don't keep up replacing the generation that's coming offline, by 2025, we're going to have a problem and a mismatch between what we can supply in the energy markets and what is needed for the growing population. And they laughed at me.
How do we cure cancer? How do we do that? Because, big pharma chucking you full of drugs and chemotherapy and radiotherapy, it's clearly not doing the job.
Correct. Yeah. And actually, just to go back a bit, it used to be 1 in 40 people got cancer. So there is no surprise when it's 1 in 2 people now, 1 in 2 men, 1 in 3 women, based on the WHO in 2018. So it's only increasing since then. But I think that most people will not agree with this, but there's, in my opinion, only one disease, and that's the body in misalignment. And it shows up and manifests in a multitude of different ways, depending on the person and the body. But if we can listen to the body and, remove the toxins or the poison, which we're exposed to in many different ways, and nourish the body heals itself.
So, you're a best-selling author, and it's very much, because this is interesting to me, the idea of, save yourself. Because certainly over the last 3 years, throughout the COVID era and further on, you're always looking to someone else to save you. Let the government save you. Let the WHO save me, as opposed to actually taking some self-responsibility. So it's interesting that your book is Save Yourself, not Save Me.
Another program I believe we've been taught, and most of us embody, is that being selfish is bad, and that's not the case. We're each a unique soul that's here to have our own experience. And so, it's disconnecting us from that we're worthy enough to look after ourselves and put ourselves first. So that's really what I teach most of the people that I work with, is that, they need to look after themselves first. Once your cup is full, you can pour for everyone.
That's all from us this evening. Whatever you're up to this weekend, I hope you have an absolutely great one and do something that makes you genuinely happy. Now, it seems like quite an obvious statement, but how many of us actually take the time to have fun? Feels like something reserved only for children. It's time to grow up, be sensible. I was told that for years when I was touring the country in rock and roll bands. It's time to get a proper job. But what is a proper job? What is a sensible life? Get up, work, eat, and sit on the sofa for a bit and then sleep and repeat. Doesn't sound that appealing to me. Yeah, that's what most of us do most days of the week. Maybe you live for the weekend, I'm guilty of that. But why limit yourself to enjoying 29% of your time on earth? Now, when I was a personal trainer, about 50% of my clients were there not to lose weight, but simply for the release, to be able to sound off and voice their problems to a relative stranger without fear of repercussions. Now, they often say to me at the end, Feel so much better now, thank you. And I'd be there stood with the weight of their burden on my shoulders. Now, it wasn't sustainable. And it ended up affecting me mentally. I was taking on people's problems, carrying them with me. And so in the end, I asked for some advice from a friend who, as well as getting me to like envisage this bubble around myself, said, take half an hour a day to laugh. Said it didn't matter what it was, whether it was silly cat videos on YouTube or some stand-up comedy, just take that half hour and laugh. The more hysterical, the better. Release those endorphins. Now, it made a huge difference to me. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is because we're all taking on the burden of a broken society. We're worrying about the future of the world and the future of our kids. Am I even going to be able to pay the mortgage in 3 months? That's a massive weight to take. And so I would suggest that we all put that load down, if only for just half an hour, and take some more time for ourselves. It's important. Good night.